Many of us are looking at colleges right now. With the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action, we're worried about maintaining the balance of diversity and how it will impact our future, especially in some of our country's most high-profile universities. For some, though, the concerns about school privilege start much earlier, in middle school.
I have to funnel all my energy and all my time into this one test so that I don't mess up and screw up my entire life. I remember all of my friends at that time were saying it's sty or die. I think at that moment, I really just wanted to break down and cry.
First of all, why do people even care about going to these schools? High schools in New York City are already segregated because they're so dependent on zoning and thus influenced by housing discrimination. What's so bad about these schools being segregated? Well, they're perceived as gateways to highly selective colleges and career success. In short, upwards mobility. For example, a study conducted in 2014 found that around 90% of students from these exam schools end up graduating, compared to 53.7% of students in New York City as a whole. They also accumulate more cultural capital. For example, the percentage of students who earn a Regents or Advanced Regents diploma by taking more advanced math and science courses is anywhere from 65 to 80% at these schools, while in the rest of the city, 9.2. But it's more than advanced classes and fancy programs. Just like Choate, they give you centrality, access to a large alumni network of successful people, and the prestige of being part of that social group, which puts them far ahead of their peers in local public schools without the name.
SHSAT is the sole requirement to gain admission to one of the 8 such high schools in New York City. Black and Latino students make up 70% of the students in New York City, yet this year they received just over 10% of the offers from the 8 schools.
This clip is from 2019, but things haven't really gotten better since then. This year at Stuyvesant, out of around 900 admissions offers made, only 7 went to Black students and 20 to Latino students. At Staten Island Tech, out of 287 offers, 2 Black students, up from 0 last year. Back when I still lived in New York, there was huge social upheaval because school chancellor Richard Carranza and Mayor de Blasio wanted to phase out and eliminate the test and reserve it for the top 7% of students from the city's middle schools, similar to the UT system. This was met with outrage from white and Asian parents, so much so that the policy died in Albany without being passed through the legislature. In response, they created the Discovery Program, which is sort of a transfer program which expands the means of admission, but still is SHSAT dependent. In response, my middle school's PTO organization, along with some others, sued, claiming the program violated the Equal Protection Clause. They lost.
It is the most objective way to determine an admissions process.
Today, through the lens of critical race theory, we're going to examine how this patently isn't true. While these patterns certainly manifest across the country, we're going to focus specifically on the history of New York City's problem of segregation and how it impacts the specialized high schools. Critical race theory rejects popular understandings of racism. For example, cultural racism, a term coined by Professor Gulash Boza, which attributes disadvantaged racial groups' lack of prosperity to behavior and culture instead of structural factors. For example, this person explicitly claims that there is no institutionalized racism, and that Black and brown communities are just culturally inferior. But CRT argues that this is a fallacy. Instead, racism is embedded in our systems through laws, institutions, and structures. For example, let's first look at how it's embedded in the writing of the test. At first glance, it's easy to see why people have claimed it's objective. It's math and English, you get it right or wrong, everyone gets the same tests and takes it at roughly the same time. Perfectly fair, right? Wrong. Studies have found that admission requirements based solely on a single test score are limited and discriminatory. That's why colleges don't determine admission solely on test results, and more are going test optional. But secondly, this test, which is made for admission into public schools, has content that is inaccessible to public school students.
You have to be prepped for another test that's not aligned to state standards, which you're learning every day, in order to get the opportunity to go to a public school. It's a tricky test. 5 answers for a question, 3 of them are correct, but one of them is more correct. So it's about learning how to take the test rather than really testing what you know.
The test writers have essentially dictated that the only people who will be able to do well are those who are able to access expensive test prep. This is an example of structural racism, which CRT credits as a source for much of the racist incidents we see in society today. We see not only the commercial writers of the test, in concert with the New York City Department of Education who contracts them, and the legislators that codified into state laws that these schools are allowed to make these tests their sole admission standard, and the test prep companies which benefit off the dysfunctional system and are rarely located in Black and brown neighborhoods working together to perpetuate the system. Furthermore, structural racism points to these interinstitutional interactions not only at one point in time, but across history. And what history tells us is that the root, the concept itself of the standardized test, is racist.
Carl Brigham. He was a young psychologist during World War I who was obsessed with measuring human intelligence. He would devise puzzles for soldiers that supposedly measured their intelligence. He concluded that white people of English, Scottish, and Dutch descent were smartest. At the very bottom were Black people and recent immigrants from Poland and Italy. He ignored the fact that some test takers didn't speak English. He ignored how some people were barred from receiving an adequate education, which meant some puzzles like this one could be quite challenging. He just assumed the scores reflected the innate intelligence of different races.
It's with this racist mindset that Carl Brigham would eventually go on to write the SAT, when the College Board asked him to devise a test that could help eliminate undesirable, or Black and brown, applicants. It wasn't really popular until after World War II, when the GI Bill helped send tons of US citizens to college. With this new volume of applications, the SAT became a staple in order to quickly rank applications and weed out the so-called undesirables. This is consistent with the ideas of old and new racism. Omi and Winant, known for the racial formation theory, claim that policymakers and powerful figures in society seek to make the racial order seem natural and normal because overt racism is becoming less acceptable. We can see this in the presentation of the test, which is made by white people for white people, as perfectly objective in order to perpetuate inequality. Furthermore, the biased nature of these questions is self-perpetuating because they use old questions to write new ones. Questions are good if Black and Latino students scored lower and white students scored higher. The purpose of the test was always exclusion. So how could it be discriminatory to remove an admissions tool which is designed to keep out students of color and has been exacerbating the situation for years? Finally, unfortunately, it doesn't really matter if the test is geared against Black and brown students, if societal pressure dissuades or inhibits them from taking the test, or if they're not even made aware that it exists in the first place.
I felt like I was the only Latino taking the test. It was pretty intimidating just sitting in that environment and taking a test in an environment that's so different from what you're used to.
Black and brown students being seen as inherently or like intellectually inferior, and like the test is like set against you. As a student of color, you shouldn't expect yourself to get through the exam or to pass it or to go to a specialized high school.
Enoch Knocklin, a current senior at the Brooklyn Latin High School, wrote about his experience taking the SHSAT as a Black student. He reported that being surrounded by students who, quote, by statistical comparison had a better chance than he did of getting in made him doubt himself. He double-checked answers that he already knew were correct and sometimes accidentally filled in the wrong bubble on the answer sheet, end quote. These are examples of a phenomenon called stereotype threat, in which the fear of performing poorly and confirming negative stereotypes about their social groups, or in this case racial groups, causes students to perform poorly. With each year that the schools remain segregated, the condition only gets worse. This touches on the element of critical race theory, which recognizes and embraces the lived experiences of people of color. This isn't information you'll find in data reports, but it's crucial to understanding the socialization and behaviors of children of color in a city. When Stuyvesant's parent coordinator visited predominantly Black and Latino middle schools, he found that many students had never even heard about the specialized high school exam. So it wasn't just that the game was rigged. They didn't even know they were allowed to play, and by the time they learned the rules, they would already be years behind their white and Asian counterparts. Some people may attempt to blame this part on housing discrimination, since middle schools are often zoned. But this too is a fallacious argument that's been made time and time again.
To make this argument, William Jansen had to ignore the many powerful tools available to the Board of Education. The Board of Education was responsible for where kids went to school. It decided where to build new schools. It drew zoning lines. It decided where experienced teachers teach. There were many ways the board could have made schools less segregated.
Plenty of people still believe in the myth of the objective, meritocratic SHSAT. Plenty of people don't. There have been attempts to salvage it, like DREAM, which is essentially a test prep program funded by the city, and the Discovery Transfer program that I mentioned earlier. But as we can see, the numbers aren't getting any better. It's true that according to critical race theory, this is a pervasive problem. Removing the SHSAT wouldn't be a real solution to segregation and inequality of opportunity either. We'd have to go deep into all these institutions and attempt to reverse practices that are firmly entrenched in decades and decades of history. It would be a massive undertaking and almost doesn't seem realistic. But perhaps it's the most difficult things that are the most worth doing.